Elon doesn't call it a climate company. And his real focus is making a car that's sexy, that is well priced, that you want to drive, that drives cool. Those are the human incentive reasons for why you buy a car. Is it cheap enough or well priced? Does it look cool? Am I going to get cool points for driving it? And does it look cool and drive cool? So I feel really good when I get into it.
You are listening to The Sure Shot Entrepreneur, a podcast for founders with ambitious ideas. Venture capital investors and other early believers tell you relatable, insightful, and authentic stories to help you realize your vision. Welcome to The Sure Shot Entrepreneur. I'm your host, Gopi Rangan. My guest today is Atlas Berry. He's the founder and general partner at Mission One Capital. Mission One backs mission-driven founders, and the main focus is on frontier technology solutions to sustainability-related problems. What does that mean? Why is this topic important? And how did Atlas get into the world of venture capital? He's been an active angel investor before, and he decided to start his own firm. Let's talk to Atlas and find out. Atlas, welcome to the Sure Shot Entrepreneur.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Look forward to chatting.
Tell us about yourself, starting with where you grew up. You grew up in New Jersey, lived in Paris for some time. Now you live in Miami. Tell us a little more about that story.
For sure. I always say both from a business and personal side, I've had a circuitous path to get to where I am. But I grew up in New York, New Jersey. That's where my family's from. And if you're a true New Yorker, then I'll say I'm from New Jersey. If you're not from the region, I can claim a bit of New York through my parents. But yeah, going from New Jersey up until middle school. And then when it came to high school, my whole family moved out to Paris, France. And so taking myself from the armpit of America to the premium cultural hub in the world was definitely a culture shock, but really started to open up my eyes to a lot of the global issues, global economics, and which is what I ended up studying even in high school, and first got me interested in thinking about macro, larger existential threats and problems, which I guess came full circle later in life.
Now, I lived in France for about a year when I was in business school. I was in Fontainebleau. It's a fascinating country. There's a lot of rich history, good wine, very good cheese. I really enjoyed my time there as well. But you also, in your first job, you had a focus on Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. You seem to have had a very broad global perspective much earlier in your life, starting with high school and later when you started your career as well.
Yeah, I think the interesting story there is that after school, I went to UPenn undergrad, Wharton, did the whole banking thing out of school in New York. I found myself in New York doing traditional M&A investment banking. I'm at JP Morgan. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. That international global itch really started to come to the forefront. And so I found out about a small satellite office in Johannesburg, South Africa, that was really covering all of sub-Saharan Africa and doing industries across metals and mining and real estate and financial institutions that were expanding through the region, et cetera. And so it was an opportunity for me to think about, okay, how do I go to an area where I've never been and I can get a really, high risk, high reward type of learning experience. And that was definitely what I got in sub-Saharan Africa. I would say traditional M&A in New York, you move some Excel files here and there, you get a deal toy after a deal is done and you move on to the next one. But there we'd travel all throughout the continent and be in risk of our lives sometimes. And I got robbed twice while out there on business trips and competing against Russian banks who would come with suitcases of cash to sell-side engagements. So it was definitely what I call Jason Bourne meets banking. And so that kind of frontier environment is really, I think, started to add to my risk tolerance later in life. Even after that, I tried to be an entrepreneur throughout sub-Saharan Africa because I saw so many opportunities. Eventually got kicked out of the country because my visa ran out after I left JP Morgan. And I found myself in New York kind of figuring out what was next. And that was the start of my operator journey when I finally bumped into an early stage company and joined as like the 8th employee and helped us grow to do 40 million in revenue. So it was like starting in Africa to end up being an operator is definitely something I wouldn't have planned, but an amazing experience.
You had an immersive experience in different cultural contexts on how to do business in different parts of the world. And that kind of prepared you for your own entrepreneurial journey. You were a VP at Viacom at one point, and you were a CFO at a startup. And eventually you decided to start your own venture capital firm. What was the genesis for that?
Yeah. So one part of the story that is hard to fathom, I guess, that really was a like pivoted point in me getting into venture was that after working at that startup, I got poached from that startup to join a large talent agency in Los Angeles called Creative Artists Agency. And they're one of the largest talent agencies in the world now. But at that time, they were expanding internationally. And so folks like myself who had appetite to go into emerging markets were getting brought in to really help from a corporate development standpoint and expand the entire company into the BRIC countries, essentially, is what I was covering. And while doing that, I'd also meet all the international talent that would come through there. So we created a joint venture in India to get into Bollywood at the time. And so Indian actors were looking to come into the US and come into Hollywood. So we'd help advise on that. Or US music talent would be wanting to do a world tour. Think about how does Justin Bieber tour throughout Brazil or something like that. Through that process, met a lot of large global acts. Linkin Park, the rock band, was one of those folks who I met along that journey and really pitched them to join the agency. But that pitch became a job opportunity to help join them, essentially run what became their family office and help them go into a lot of areas, including venture. We built a venture fund together, and then I ran that fund for a number of years as a generalist fund. And so had some good bets in there. The Robinhood, Lyft, Blue Bottle Coffee, Snapchat, Possible Foods, and a bunch of others. And so I was like, okay, I have success in venture. I think I'm decent, or at least I'm lucky in venture. But how do I apply this to something that really speaks to what my skill set is, which are the larger global existential threats? And that's when the climate kind of angle started to come into play. 2018 or so, you're seeing generalist funds who had maybe either gotten burned from clean tech 1.0 in the mid 2000s come back around, or other funds are now seeing that software is eating the world and there's more opportunities in areas just out of enterprise SaaS. And now we can look at things like the energy grid, and we can look at mobility and some of these like larger issues. And so anyway, climate tech became the new hype thing. I would say at 2018, after the IPCC report, which is like a big climate report that explains all the problems. If we don't reach this level of decarbonization, how screwed are we, kind of thing? And through that is, okay, this is how bad it will be. But also for those who solve for these problems, look at these massive TAMs, these massive opportunities of wealth creation and generation. And so that's what got me excited to get into the climate tech space. And so as an angel investor, like you mentioned, I always say, lose your own money before taking other people's money to lose theirs. So in the process of doing that, I became an angel investor for about 5 or 6 years, really learning by doing, learning by investing in all types of sectors, subsectors of the climate crisis. And through that learning, eventually became distilled down my thesis of what Mission One Capital became. Yeah.
What a fascinating story. You're very humble. You say that you got lucky early in your venture career, but one never really knows whether he or she is a good venture capital investor until perhaps towards the end of their career. Early days, all you know is whether you're getting lucky or not. And you took that faith and you became an angel investor, started investing your own money, and then you got that conviction that, okay, it's time to start a firm. Tell us more about the new firm that you've started. What is the
For
firm
sure.
about, and how is it different from other VC firms?
Sure. So part of the big insight that I think I unlocked early, which helped me to launch the firm, is realizing that there's two, but probably more ways to attack climate tech when it comes to venture capital. Climate notoriously is a very macro problem. And so there are other types of asset classes of finance that can really do well in this space: project finance, infrastructure finance, debt, et cetera. But venture in climate is really played two ways, let's say. On one side, you have the deep tech hardware approach. On that side of things, you're getting either people with a science background or understanding of the lab network in the US. Say, for example, ideas that are spitting out of the lab and going to commercialization. So investing at that inflection point, knowing that it's hardware, knowing that it's going to be a longer, maybe return profile or time horizon. And so potentially needing more patient capital. And so you get breakthrough energies of the world doing those type of things with Bill Gates, the clear patient capital. And then on the other side, you have generalist investors or software investors who are looking at business models that they've seen in the generalist market. So enterprise SaaS, API-based businesses, transactional businesses, marketplaces, et cetera, and then applying those business models to the sectors like energy and mobility and carbon markets. And so looking at software forward approaches, to climate and using that as a way in, and then eventually working yourself maybe to IoT as a commoditized component to the software, and then maybe making your way toward hardware deep tech over time. And so that latter approach, that software forward approach, is really what we ended up doing at Mission One Capital. And that was what we saw as the initial insight. The other piece I think is really exciting to me, at least, to work on climate is that it is global. I've worked in every continent across the world, but for this specific start of Mission One, let's say, we're starting in the US and in Europe. Having lived and worked on both sides, sometimes I feel even more comfortable in Europe in some regard. So that's also a differentiator that I think provides us a competitive advantage. Because a couple of things. One is when it comes to climate in Europe, the regulatory environment is very different than the US environment. And so they're almost more forward thinking when it comes to climate policy. And so you're seeing the implementation of different solutions come faster, and the penetration of things like EV vehicles come faster in parts of Europe than you're seeing in the US. And so as an investor who invests in both sides, one of our differentiators we feel is our ability to see some of those trends of what does it look like when penetration looks like this, or what does it look like when business models get created on top of the energy grid to allow for things to happen, that take time to happen in the US. We might see them already happening in Europe and be able to have a prepared mind. So what it could look like in the US might be XYZ, and we can invest along that kind of thought process. And so that US-Europe connectivity is a real big differentiator for us.
I see that you've strategically thought about how to structure your investment thesis. You invested the seed stage and you're broadly focused on US and Europe because that kind of feeds your investment philosophy. And you also invest in B2B and B2C. So it's a broad mandate. What's your advice to founders that focus on climate and sustainability related problems? Starting a company is already difficult, and there are some unique challenges specific to this sector. What are some 2 or 3 things that you would like to share with founders so that they could be a lot more successful?
So I think there's like a couple of different schools of thought, but I think if I were to give advice to founders, there's 2 different types of founders. There's founders, I think, in this space that either have spent a lot of time in climate. So maybe they studied environmental studies in college or some sort of engineering that can be applied to things like weather forecasting or geospatial analysis, et cetera. And then they're going into kind of find solutions within a space or an industry that they already understand and they're looking to disrupt. And there are other types of founders that I think are coming as from general market, or being a general market founder, as I like to call it, a generalist. Maybe they were creating a marketplace for dogs to dog walk them or whatever the idea might be. But then they're saying, okay, I really now understand marketplaces. How do I apply that to a sector that I may be more passionate about? And so they're coming in as an outsider and bringing new business models to archaic industries. And so I think both are really interesting. And one side, sometimes you need to have that institutional knowledge. Let's say in the energy space, like it's good to know how energy is distributed around the US. There are different corridors, different regulatory sectors, whether or not it's public owned or investor owned kind of utility companies, et cetera. You have to understand the nuances around that to be successful, I think. So that's like that first type of entrepreneur can be really successful. However, I think sometimes also the malaise and the inertia of old archaic industries need to be disrupted with new concepts. So I think that's like the first thing is which one of those buckets you're in as an entrepreneur. I think the second piece that's, again, very specific to climate that I think can be helpful and also challenging, let's say, is the regulatory tailwinds or headwinds. So, there are certain sectors that are going to really benefit from things like the IRA, the infrastructure bill, and other types of things that have opened up capital, whether it be straight grant-related capital or tax incentives and other types of incentives to get things moving. As a founder, I think really understanding if you have tailwinds or headwinds from a regulatory standpoint is extremely key. And then the third piece I think is super important that I always say when it comes to climate, it has to solve both a climate problem, but also it has to fit human incentive structures. You have to assume that corporates, although they have good intent, you have to sell to them in a way that they understand, which is profit and loss. So there has to be a financial gain to who you're selling into rather than a sustainability or kind of value-based sell. That big piece, to be honest, helps us vet a lot of companies when they talk about, hey, this needs to happen. I'm like, okay, that's great. But is the incumbent incentivized to do that? Or are you finding new ways to incentivize incumbents to make those changes? If that answer isn't solved for, it's hard to get that initial product market fit. You're swimming against the tide of human incentive structures. And so I think that's a little bit of nuance there, but that's a big key there.
So know the knowledge space really well, understand the problem you're solving in the climate and sustainability topics. Have respect for regulatory restrictions, and there might be headwinds. You have to have a plan for how to manage that. And thirdly, make it economically viable and understand the human incentives of people who already exist in this field who will be affected by the solution that you're bringing into the world.
And perfect example is always the Tesla story. Elon doesn't call it a climate company. And his real focus is making a car that's sexy, that is well priced, that you want to drive, that drives cool. Those are the human incentive reasons for why you buy a car. Is it cheap enough or well priced? And does it look cool and drive cool? So I feel really good when I get into it. Let's put aside all the sustainability benefits. Those incentive structures are built. So like I personally have a Tesla. I bought it for those human incentive reasons. And then I'm like, oh yeah, the sustainability benefit gives me that extra point, obviously, as a climate investor to be able to talk through. But those human incentives are extremely important.
I can see what you mean by human incentives. Can you give an example of one of your startups that you've invested in? How did the first conversation happen? What were you looking for in that meeting? What questions did you ask the founders?
Yeah, so there's always a ton of examples there. Let's talk about one more notable one that I think now they're really off to the races. It's a company called ChargerHelp. So ChargerHelp, what they do, they essentially track and monitor EV charging infrastructure and are able to identify when the charging stations are operational or not operational and fix them. And so that's very much so what they do. Again, if we go back to some of the things I've mentioned in terms of founders, one is the founder, Camille and Yvette. They had come from both the EV charging infrastructure and the human workforce development space previously. And so they're bringing some institutional knowledge and understanding how to do this before. However, they're tackling a new problem, which is based on some of the regulatory tailwinds, right? EV charging infrastructure is a big piece of the infrastructure bill, the IRA, making sure there's enough charging stations so that the EV adoption can happen is very much so in the regulatory limelight. And then also making sure those charging stations are operational, so people drive up to a charging station and it actually works, is also in the regulatory framework. And so they have tailwinds behind them. When I first met them, they had a business that was very like people driven, very manual and people driven, meaning they would find out that a charging station doesn't work in a certain location. They would dispatch or roll a truck, a technician that was trained up to do this, to the actual location. He or she would make the change and they'd come home and then they'd bill for that service. So it's a very manual process. That's a great example of them solving the problem, but it's not VC scalable. And so one of the big changes that they made, I've been tracking them for quite some time after that first conversation to see if they could make the pivot from something that was very manual to something that was very scalable. And what they did that I think was really that changed the game of and the inflection of what the company actually is and what they stand for and how they operate is that they created a way to actually pull log data remotely from the charging stations and almost monitor them remotely. And so as they bring in more and more customers with thousands and thousands of charging stations, they can see them all from a centralized hub, right? And so they can remotely look at them. They can pull in log data, which they can then interpret to what the actual error might be in regards to the charging station being operational. And in some cases, they can actually fix those things over the air. So they don't have to actually send people to those locations. And so that change, moving to more of a SaaS software kind of business model, changed the game in terms of how their success has gone. I think they've had a real inflection point in terms of the business model going forward. And they've just been off to the races.
Oh, this is such a painful problem. What used to be a 5-minute drive up to a gas station, fill your gas tank, and just move on with your life has now turned into a 1-hour episode where I have to wait for the charging station to become available. And then I go up to the charge station to charge, and that takes 20, 30 minutes, maybe longer. And when charging stations are broken, it's even more frustrating because there are charging stations installed, but only 4 out of the 6 are actually functional.
Yeah.
This is a very important problem to solve. I can see why this is needed in the world. Very exciting.
100%. And that's where range anxiety comes into play because people are saying, hey, I want to buy an EV, but then what if I can't charge it because of this issue? Even though, to be honest, like if you look at the data, above 50% of the charging is happening at home. And most people don't drive past the actual like mileage max of a charge. Let's put that aside. People still have anxiety around charging. And so you have to solve that human issue regardless.
Yes. Yeah. Eventually it boils down to human issues. How many startups do you invest in on average in a year? And what stage do you like to invest in? Seed is a broad definition, but if you could narrow it down to the kind of companies you like to talk to.
Yeah, for sure. So we invest in about 10 to 12 companies a year. So I think we're pretty active in that regard. We invest at the pre-seed sometimes and seed based on a lot of different factors, things like traction, obviously, but valuation, team strength, and size of the opportunity and other types of things. And I can give examples even of that. So yeah, we do that. And then the types of areas that we like to invest in are broad, I would say, when it comes to climate tech. I would put them in a couple different buckets. Energy, like I mentioned before, is an area that we're really interested in. Mobility, carbon markets, extremely interesting. We can go into that. Circularity, environmental management, as I like to call it, or like industrial type processes is another sector. So those are the like bigger, broader sectors though. But I think at any given time when you talk to me, there's definitely specific subsectors or trends that I'm really watching that I'm really excited about. If you want me to tell you some of those.
Yes, let's get into it. What trends are you excited about?
Yeah. What we like to do as well is have what we call, every venture investor likes to talk about having a prepared mind, but really I like to just call it nerding out on specific sub trends. And then we try to find opportunities and then we see if we can find companies that are doing those things, sometimes in the way of just learning and understanding how those problems are being solved, even if they're a later stage company. Helps to inform us to identify maybe earlier stage companies that might be filling some gaps. But some areas now that we're really excited about that we've been nerding on about at the company, data center optimization. So when it comes to data centers, obviously we have this whole AI boom happening, and in the background, crypto is still gaining ground. And so both of those industries require a lot of compute, extremely heavy on the data center. And so through that, there's a lot of heat and a lot of energy that's used when it comes to compute around these two types of processes or industries. And so we've started to see a lot of companies focus on doing a couple of things, optimizing compute going into the data center, but also thinking about things like cooling of the data center itself, fueling the data center energy with renewable energy, making that easy, and other types of things to just make that a more sustainable process. Because if you think about the tailwinds of where data center growth is happening, we definitely need to have the counterbalance of sustainability to not blow up our climate goals in the process of bringing extremely fast AI assistance to your iPhone.
Yeah, the demand for data continues to explode. Connectivity has become more and more ubiquitous, and there's a lot of need for storage, and all of that kind of boils down to eventually managing data center infrastructure. And we need to be able to be efficient about that.
Another area that we start to think about as renewable energy is getting deployed, it's getting deployed both from central sources like commercial grade solar farms, et cetera, but also residential, small business, community solar, more distributed energy generation. And so when you have that type of setup, and if you think about projecting that out a bit, one of the areas that we're really excited to understand more is what we call the virtual power plant. And so that's saying, what if you have distributed energy generation? So let's try to use this in more layman's terms. Let's say across the US, there's thousands of people who have solar on their roof. What if you were able to map all those individuals together who are generating power and take the excess power that they're not using for their home and pledge that back and earn on that excess power in some way? So there are different ways people are testing and trying this out, whether that be pledging energy back to the grid and offsetting energy costs as a result. There's pros and cons and different things to think about when it comes to some of that, especially when you talk about grids and utilities. There's conversations around just pushing that energy to others who would then buy that excess distributed energy, peer-to-peer almost, like energy generation and consumption and all of that. And so with those mechanisms come underlying systems that have to get created to enable VPPs to operate. Like, how do you map where a certain electron came from and give people credit and pay them for that electron that they generated and vice versa? That's what's really interesting to us. That's a solar example in Europe where EV penetration is above 50%. Like in Norway, EV penetration is at 80% of all new vehicles are EV. People are starting to test EV type versions of that example as well. Can we pool together large amounts of EV vehicles and then use them as virtual power plants and almost pledge them as both like demand response? So if energy peaks at a certain time, rather than going to peaker plants, which are very pollutive, run by coal and things like that, you can maybe go to this distributed energy source, or just in general on a day-to-day, even tap into this energy source. The cars are basically like mobile batteries. Can you tap into them some way? So yeah, distributed energy and VPPs are very interesting to us as well.
I see you're excited about many emerging trends in this sector. And I want to
Yeah,
ask
I
you
can
about,
keep going. I can keep
yeah, I
going, but
can see that. We can spend a whole couple of hours on this. But I want to ask you about, like, why do you say no when founders pitch to you? Let's say we meet a founder and the founder is clearly passionate and knowledgeable about the space. They understand the regulatory side and they anticipate headwinds and they have a plan to manage that. And they have the human side of the story. They understand how this can fit into the existing infrastructure and the way of doing business. And they fit into the topics that you talked about, like either data center or energy management. But despite all of that, you would still say no sometimes. How many startups do you meet for the 12 investments you make in a year? And what's the most common reason for you to say no?
Yeah, similar to other venture funds, most likely we see 1,000 companies a year, and we're investing in 10 of them, so a very small percentage. And there's two reasons probably that I say no. One is timing. I think timing is a big piece because on venture and specifically to my fund, we're not looking for 10, 12, 15, 20 years before payback. I'm looking for venture type returns. So 5 to 7 or so years till payback. And so you have to think about those macro trends that we talked about and when we think they're going to come online. In the background, we're projecting to ourselves, okay, if someone comes to us with, let's say, a geothermal company, geothermal currently is, I believe, maybe 1% of renewable energy right now. And so it's a very small percentage of the overall renewable story. There are some challenges that make that cost efficiency of siting an actual geothermal site to actually tap into and things like that. So there's very specific things that could be solved for with startups. So that's very interesting. But we have to believe that geothermal is going to become a larger percentage of the renewable story to invest into now within the next 5 to 7 to 10 years to be able to make that type of bet. So that's a timing thing. And there are a lot of other examples where timing is a big issue. We talked about penetration of EV vehicles. In the US, we're now at, I think we just recently got to 8 to 10% or so of all new vehicles are EV in the US or something like that. That's not 80%. And obviously that number needs to grow and it will. But what's the timing of that? And so projecting out what the timing is. And so what are the knock-on effects on different opportunities that founders are solving for? So that's, I think timing is a big one. The second one is more of probably how even you probably say no sometimes to startups is because even if there are those two types of founders, one that comes from the industry and one that doesn't, right? And I think the one who doesn't, some naivete is good, right? Not knowing the things that have set people back is very strong and positive, but knowing the history is also important. So sometimes we see founders come in with kind of a naive understanding of the challenges that they're going to face because we've seen a lot of companies that have tried this and failed, right? And that could be one part on my side or on their side, but I think not having the knowledge, even if you don't come from that space, is definitely a hindrance to your success. In some cases, even we've seen, I think we talked about it, like founders who were college dropouts and go into the insurance space, let's say, for example, and are able to get product to market. But then you're always thinking, that's great, but then do they know what that next leg up might look like? And kind of them being blind to what the potential opportunities as they do grow because they didn't do that homework sometimes leads us to say no.
Starting companies is already hard. And investing in companies, choosing one that you want to back is a very difficult decision. I can see that you have a methodical approach to looking at these opportunities, finding the right kind of fit that works for you.
And also, I'll add on also at the early stage, the other piece that's like more of the feel, right, comes from the fact that I've been investing for the past decade and just been in this space for a while, is that kind of gut feel of on the founder. And they have to have this kind of mix of confidence slash bleeding on hubris slash like charisma as a salesperson, not just to sell their product to us to invest, but also to be able to sell customers, to sell other employees and top-notch people to join them. And so that kind of like it factor on the founder side, I always like to see, okay, who out of the founding team is going to be that person and who out of the founding team is going to be the product lead or the technical lead. And I like when I see the two of them together to say, okay, someone's going to be heads down while one person's heads up. Like in agent world, when I was a talent agent, you always had one guy doing the hunting and one guy or gal doing the farming after things have been hunted and the management of things once they're farmed. And so you need that kind of combination of those two characters to work well together. And so I think those are the things we also look for.
Very nicely said. Especially at the pre-seed and seed stage, so much depends on the team. It's good to see that the team can actually execute. And you can see signs of that early in the days of the company.
Yeah.
We're coming towards the end of our conversation, and I want to ask you about your community involvement. Is there a nonprofit organization you are passionate about? Which one?
Sure. So in Miami, a big nonprofit that I like to work with here is the Nature Conservancy. And the Nature Conservancy obviously is one of the largest environmental based nonprofits in the world. But specific to Miami, I think what they've done really well is making sure that the environment is one of the key pillars in all the government conversations, and especially around government budgets and how money is being allocated and resources are being allocated. Because I think previously we're clearly living in a place where flooding is happening all the time. We're right at the edge of the Everglades, which has an amazing backstory. And if you haven't read The Swamp, which is a book on the history of the Everglades, actually by a friend of mine, Michael Grunwald, talks about the constant battle that humans and nature have had down here in Miami. So I think the importance of making sure that we live harmoniously with the environment down here in Miami is extremely important. So the Nature Conservancy is really doing a lot of that work down here, among others, but that's one that I'm really involved with.
Atlas, thank you very much for spending time with me and sharing your experiences, giving very nuanced examples of what to look for and how to build a successful startup in the climate and the sustainability space. I look forward to sharing your nuggets of wisdom with the world.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. It was good to chat. I look forward to hearing from everyone creating solutions in the climate tech space.
Thank you for listening to The Sure Shot Entrepreneur. I hope you enjoyed listening to real-life stories about early believers supporting ambitious entrepreneurs. Please subscribe to the podcast and post a review. Your comments will help other entrepreneurs find this podcast. I look forward to catching you at the next episode.